Hello and welcome to the third of 3 modules for Conflict Resolution Skills Training by the Sierra Club Colorado chapter. This was a live training on July 13th, 2019. It was also recorded via webinar. This conflict resolution training was hosted and led by Tabor and Emily from CDR Associates. And the third module will cover the types of conflict response, conflict and disagreement, and skills for responding to conflict. Thank you for participating in this training.
The first type of conflict response is on a scale of cooperativeness and assertiveness. The least cooperative, the least assertive response is avoiding. If you're avoiding, you're not addressing that person's interests, you're not addressing your interests. You are not addressing the conflict at all. And it's ironic that this is my personal conflict reaction since I work in a very conflict-charged field. But it has its values. There are times when using conflict makes sense. You might be a conflict avoider when it's not that important of an issue. If it's, let's say someone put their coffee cup outside the sink and it's driving you crazy, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not nearly as important as wolves or climate change, then maybe it's not worth broaching. You can use it when you're still gathering information. You don't want to broach a subject when you're not sure what you know and don't know. You do not want to use it when it's something you care about, when it's something you're passionate about, when it's aligned with a value of yours. Avoiding a conflict is just going to lead to frustration and resentment. You also don't want to use it when you're in charge with making some sort of resolution. If you're a team leader and you're actively avoiding conflict, well, I think you were talking earlier, part of your job is just being open and receptive. If you were a conflict avoider, that would be a serious problem in your role. The next type of conflict response I want to cover real quick is accommodating. And on this chart of assertiveness and cooperativeness, it's unassertive and cooperative, meaning you put the other person's interests ahead of your own. And there are a lot of times, fortunately for me, my partner, my fiance, is accommodating. He is more open to just going with the flow. It's one that preserves relationships. It's one where you put the values of the other person ahead of your own because you want to make sure that they're happy, that relationship is more important to you than the outcome. It's one where sometimes you use it because you were wrong. You're like, oops. So I'll be more accommodating and be willing to put this person's interests because they're in the right. So when do you not want to use it? You don't want to use it when there are high stakes. If you think, oh, there's a chance the other person is wrong, or there's a chance my interests really need to be protected here, you're not going to be benefiting anyone by accommodating the other person's interests without expressing your own. It's also not great if your core interests are being neglected. So let's go back to I-70. Maybe you say, oh, it doesn't really matter if we widen the highway, when personally that is such an important value to you. All that's going to come out of that is resentment. Does that make sense? Let's move to the next slide. So compromising. I don't know if anyone here is naturally inclined to just cut the cake in half. You want half, I want half, fine. We'll just do it. We'll be done. We'll find a middle ground between your interests and my interests. And this is oftentimes a great response because it's quick. It's efficient. You get the job done. When is it not a great response? Right, so maybe it's not a great response when it's a really important issue. When something is like I-70. Well, we'll just widen the highway a little. That's not helping CDOT, and that's not helping the communities. You can't just widen the highway a little. Huh?
It also doesn't advance the relationship issues. It's neutral on relationship issues.
Exactly.
It says, you're you, I'm me. We'll just divide it in half, and you go do what you're going to do. So you don't build trust.
Exactly. And in fact, you might be like, oh, they were a pain to work with because I had to give up half of the things I wanted.
It's entirely possible that you do not accomplish what you've set out to accomplish.
Exactly. From Sierra Club's perspective, let's say you have a position on wolves And if you, not to bring up wolves again and again, but if you meet halfway, have you really accomplished what you set out to do? Maybe, but maybe not. When you're making policy, quite often, you can be compromising or collaborative in the implementation of a decision, but you would be undermining the values you hold if you were compromising in the creation of that policy. So thank you, that was great. Any other comments before we move on? Great, so next slide. So competing is assertive. You are putting your interests ahead of everyone else's interests. And there are times to use this. In an emergency, you don't have time to check in with Betty Jo and Brian and Kirby and make sure everyone's on the same page and get some sort of agreement on the table and then implement it. It's an emergency. You got to take action. You just got to make a decision. Yes, his comment was, it sounds like a military. Exactly. It's very, we think of a dictator or a tyrant making a top-down decision. But there is a place for it. Who can think of times when you wouldn't want to use it? Most of the time. Exactly. Being a competitive person, putting your interests ahead of everyone else is not healthy for relationships. You're not going to be respecting people's psychological and procedural needs. It'll be interesting to get into our simulation a little bit later because it's on the table. Nobody really wants to be told what to do, handed down decisions all the time. And so finally, the last one is collaborating. And it is the last one because it's the one that most respects your interests and the other person's interests. It's the one that builds relationships. It's the one that is most likely to think outside the box when you're looking at solutions. But when wouldn't you want to use collaborating? Emergencies, that's a great one. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources. That's about the only time when you don't want to use collaborating. Time and resource. If you are constrained, if you don't have budget, if you don't have time, collaborating might not be an option. So let's flip to our next slide. Thank you. So the first question here, how do you usually respond to conflict? If we look at that chart with the 5 boxes, we have avoiding, accommodating, collaborating, compromising, and competing. I've already said I'm most likely to be an avoider. It's not something to be proud of, but that's where I fall. So if I could see by show of hands, who in here also thinks that they're probably an avoider in most conflicts? There we go. Angela? All right, we can make a club and never address any conflict ever. The situation? That's right. Sometimes it's more important. Yeah, that's a great point. Who in here would say that usually they're accommodating? They're willing to put the relationship before. That's great. People probably like working with you. Who in here, by show of hands, would say most of the time they're a little competitive? They're putting their interests ahead of the group. Someone's honest. You make decisions and you get stuff done, and it probably works. Who in here would say most of the time they're compromising? They kind of cut the cake in half, meet in the middle. Sometimes. And then, of course, who in here thinks they're naturally collaborative? All right, good. Yeah, that's the thing. Most people like to be. And that's the segue into our next question, which is how would you like to respond to conflict? What is it, what would you hope to achieve in resolving conflict that makes you feel comfortable? Like, oh, I didn't have to dread that. I didn't have to feel helpless. I didn't have to feel anxious. So
So I thought, I was waiting for the category of naturally conflicting.
Oh, the competing.
Would that be
So
okay?
we have 2, so we shouldn't put you 2 in the same room.
There's one other category you didn't have up there that I alluded to in the first part of this, and that is just quitting. It's not avoiding, it's quitting.
Right, throwing your hat in. Say, I'm out of the game, I'm done. That is, you're right, that is a type of conflict avoidance. Yes, it is, especially with members. If volunteers, if you're looking at building a group of people who are supporting a mission and it's beyond recognizing their preference for conflict, you've almost created an environment where they get pushed out. That is, you're right, that is a problem. And so, go for it.
So I'm looking for the person that I'm avoiding to actually communicate with me rather than stab me in the back.
That sounds like our prompt with the email. Exactly. That is a problem with avoiding, is how do you get someone to a place where they're comfortable enough to tell you what their conflict is. And we're going to touch on skills next. And part of that is making sure you're asking the right questions, that you're identifying their interests and respecting that place and making it feel comfortable. And the hard part of that approach, of course, is it puts you in the position of, okay, I'm going to do something about this, and here's my steps to resolving that conflict. Did you have something to say?
I had a little bit of concern about avoiding the feelings of discomfort. And I think those are what tell you that there's a conflict. If you don't get them, how do you ever know you have a conflict? In whatever. I mean, it's that, oh, this isn't right, or.
No, that's very valid. I think one of the hardest parts of conflict is that we've been told emotions are bad. Emotions are bad. You should get emotions out of the room. And that, you're right, it's emotions are what tell you that there's a problem. It's that resentment, it's that discomfort, it's the reactions. And so it's not how do we eliminate that emotional reaction. It's how do we capitalize on that emotional reaction in order to make progress and momentum. Or judgments. Exactly. So the final question, and this is an interesting one, it might be more speculative, is how does your role in Sierra Club expect you to respond to conflict? And Will, you prompted this, I think the best way I could have asked was, your role requires you to be collaborative. Do you want to say anything more on that? Does anyone else have a role that puts them in a spot of responding to conflict?
I have a role where I'm trying to save prairie dogs, okay, in Western Colorado, and so I've been flipped off, yelled at, called a communist, stuff like that, and so I have to figure out how to respond to it, and usually I just avoid it. But sometimes if I have more than one of us there, we could talk about, biodiversity and other parts of the ecosystem.
Oh, you have one too?
I mean, as a chair running a meeting, the procedural part becomes a conflict resolution. Someone says they want to do something, it may go against the Sierra Club bylaws, and you say, we can't do that. And all those things. You're in the minority. You have to make a decision, and that's a role that that's a conflict that you have to resolve immediately.
And that's a place where competing adds a lot of value when you have to make an unpopular decision or when you have to enforce a rule. Collaboration isn't going to get around that. That's when you need a competing approach.
These aren't supposed to be value judgments. There's no right or wrong. They're just different strategies for different types of conflict, and all of them have their uses. And I think one thing we talk about at CDR is a lot of us have strengths, and sometimes our strengths can be overused strengths. So even something like active listening, that can be a real strength you have, but when somebody's hijacking the meeting and won't stop talking, your active listening strength becomes a weakness for everybody else. Or your avoidance of conflict can sometimes diffuse a situation, but if you're avoiding every conflict, that strength becomes an overused strength. So we all have those things where our strength goes too far. And so that's sort of what we're thinking, just to frame this out a little bit. All of these have a place to be used, and just thinking about where we might address a conflict differently if we chose a different modality of using it.
Mine was super quick. I just, in my role, especially member volunteer oriented, I feel pressure to be more accommodating, because there's, we want everyone to be here. We want everyone to feel like just make everyone stay together. Don't bring it up. So I just wanted to call that in.
Sure, you can be late. You're letting everyone here on time. Like, thank you for being here no matter what.
I'm curious as to why you asked. I've been fascinated with your last question, and it's making me wonder why you asked it. In other words, are you implying I should think about my role in my job, figure out how that role and job should respond to conflict, and regardless of what I am on those 5 possibilities, I need to align, I need to practice the one that my job or role requires, regardless of how I feel about that or how I'm naturally wired.
And yeah, it's less about, oh, you have to fit into this box because that's what your role expects of you. And a lot more about what parts of your job drive you crazy or make you uncomfortable or do you dislike, and how can you pull up some of those strengths that aren't natural to you or capitalize on strengths that are natural to you and start to reframe what is uncomfortable. So if I'm a conflict avoider and I work in conflict charged situations all the time, how can I recognize, oh, I'm uncomfortable because I'm not naturally drawn to bringing this up, and think, okay, in this place, it would be helpful if I brought this up, and then I can proceed. So I can check myself, check my discomfort, going back to the emotion piece, and then proceed. Tabor, did you want to add?
I think a lot of, from the survey, what we heard was, and the reason we brought this module into it was, how do we bring up disagreements? We're having trouble figuring out as a group to bring up disagreements in a productive way where it doesn't turn into a conflict charged situations or where I even feel comfortable expressing my opinion to the group. And so this was a cognitive exercise to think about how you generally bring up disagreements, and if it might be, if you're a conflict avoider, maybe it's time to bring something up in a way that is more assertive and not so avoiding. So we were trying to get folks to think about, we all respond to different conflicts differently. So these might be different times in your life. How do you usually respond? How would you have liked to respond? And how should I do it for my job to create a situation where my interests are getting met and my organizational interests are getting met? So that was sort of why we framed it, just to think of yourself in different situations and think about how to capitalize on different types of conflict responses and push yourself a little sometimes. Maybe if you're a competitor, sometimes it's time to accommodate. If you're always an accommodator, sometimes it's time to compete. So when can you bring in different tactics to meet different interests and goals? Does that answer? Did you have a thought on where you fall on this with how your job requires it? Is it different than how you would normally respond?
Yeah, I tend to be accommodating, which is kind of funny because my bosses over my career wanted me to be less accommodating because of the reasons it takes too long and it uses a lot of resources. But if I think of myself as I'm a volunteer, I'm not paid staff in the Sierra Club, and somebody is in my face screaming at me because they hate wolves and they just have to get that right into my face. I do think I have to think about what technique is the most appropriate for a Sierra Club person representing a Sierra Club in that instance. It might not be how I would want to respond to the conflict, but I've got a different hat on, especially if it's in a public setting. So.
I have a comment from the webinar, sorry. So Thomas said self-awareness is key, and then Velma agreed that Thomas is right. Part of our task as people, I think, is learning the skills that don't come naturally to broaden and enhance our life effectiveness. So thank you, Velma.
Comment was, it's good to know them all and to be able to use them to swap out hats, which is a perfect segue into skills. So Tabor is going to go through some really basic skills. The next slide covers them. We're going to discuss active listening, which we've already begun to touch on. Handling emotions. This is something we heard here. How do you respond in conflict-charged emotional situations? Body language. How are you communicating? And what can you interpret from what's being communicated non-verbally to you? Asking questions. And then finally, framing and reframing.
So we've covered some of this. Next two. Great. We already took the break. So active listening, one of the big, like I said, it can become an overused strength, especially when facilitating or listening and you're having disruptive behaviors. So I think it's a communication skill where the listener is hearing and then you're feeding back. So you're doing that testing, you're checking in. Am I getting this right? So my biggest takeaway in active listening is really it's a two-way street. Active listening is actually about asking questions as much as it is about listening. So the other thing is, like we talked about, capturing the emotion and listening and repeating, testing, am I getting it right as you go forward? So we're going to practice some of that. Next slide, please. Handling emotions, because we talked a lot about how do we do this. The principles are accept that the emotions are the normal part of the conflict. That's what's helping us identify there's a conflict here. And I think I heard you guys talking about forming, norming, storming, conforming. And we think about, or performing. We think about that model. Has anyone heard that model before with group dynamics? You form the group, you norm the group, what are our procedures, then you storm. And that can be a really scary part of it. And everyone wants to run away. And is this even going to work? And how do we go through that emotional part and respect the emotions and then we can get to performance. But we always think that apathy is actually worse than conflict. There's nothing like looking out to a room and everyone's just sitting there and they don't care. So we would choose conflict over apathy any day. Yeah, it's true. It's true. It means something's getting done. There's some transformative piece happening there. There's some innovation coming up. And how do you create room for those disruptors? Because a lot of times, they don't have the space to speak in a group because they might be thinking something totally different. So as an organization, where do we create space for disruptors who are actually perhaps pushing the pendulum to the other side where we can find the middle ground? So as a group, thinking about those emotions, thinking about those disruptive behaviors as perhaps potentially something helpful because maybe they're the ones coming out with the creative solution. How do we both facilitate emotion and facilitate disruption while allowing a space for disruption to occur to bring new ideas into the group, marching to their own drum. Learn approaches for responding to strong feelings. General approaches and strategies would be ignoring emotion sometimes as well and focusing. So if somebody's getting really worked up over here, I might go over and I use being a woman, a lot of times my voice can get like higher and people don't want to listen to it if I get upset and start talking louder. So I use body language a lot. When you're facilitating or mediating, you're a whole person. So if I have a disruptor over here who's personally attacking, I might say Richard and Kirby are personally attacking. I might move my body into the conflict. And actually then you can't even be in it anymore. And that's my role. Yeah. If there's personal threats going on and I want to stop that, I will move into that space. Same thing, I'll move close. If somebody's trying to hijack my meeting and keeps talking and talking, I'll sort of move over to them and just think that, that's enough. So using your whole body to handle emotions is really important. Me standing back here and be like, okay, thanks. Oh, that's not going to stop any sort of personal attack. Hijacking the meeting, somebody that's going on and on. This is a great thing. Okay, we captured that up here. We got that. We're going to move to the next agenda item. So those are some skills for just moving, staying on target. And that's when active listening is your overused strength because you have a responsibility for the group to keep moving the process along. And if you let somebody take it over, you're not faithful to the group process. We can also have our ground rules up there pointing to the ground rules for the meet, like you're a kindergarten teacher sometimes. We agreed on no personal attacks. We came up with that rule together to make this process work. So those are some ways to deal with emotions and disruptive behaviors. Acknowledging emotions too, and taking 5. Like, this is getting really heated in here. Is this how we want to interact right now? Sometimes you make a plea to the group. Is this what we want? Is this why we're here today? Is this how we want to interact today? Let's take 5. Let's come back. So sometimes taking a breather, stopping the process can be very helpful in diffusing a conflictual situation. And that can be just acknowledging the emotions of the group and stepping away. So any questions about that facilitation? Because that does happen, and sometimes it can be really scary and being an avoider. Yeah.
I was working with some people, and this woman went on and on. This woman kept going on and on and on about taking care of someone with dementia and blah, blah, blah. I mean, probably 15 or 20 minutes. And I tapped her on the arm and I said, Patty, you're depressing me. And she says, oh, I'm sorry. And everybody else in the room came up to me after and said, thank you for saying that. On the other hand, I think I have a woman that I've offended.
Yeah.
I couldn't take any more. I would have left the room. And everybody else was thinking the same thing. On the other hand, Patty's not happy with me.
Right.
So what do I do about that?
So from a personal I'm somebody that wants to be liked in a group. When I started working at CDR, my boss's first piece of advice to me was, it's more important to be effective than to be liked when you're doing these processes. And so I am not always liked in these processes because I will be the one that goes over and says, okay, you've had your turn, we're going to get back onto track. And so from a professional perspective, that's sort of my mantra. It's more important to be effective than to be liked. From a personal perspective, it might be worth bringing it up and saying, I realize I offended you in that situation. I'm really sorry, but we really wanted to get back to the task, and I wanted to make sure other people could talk. And so that's one way I will appeal to somebody taking over. I'll say, let's make sure, if it's maybe it's during a break even, let's make sure we hear everybody in the room today. And you have a lot of great things to say. And there's some really quiet people, and I want to make sure everyone's getting a chance to participate. So, and that can be embarrassing. So it might be something that you'd say outside, on the side, during a break. In your head, you might be thinking, I'm going to take 5. In a situation like that, sometimes you offend people, but you've preserved the group. So yeah, I don't know sometimes how to be liked and be effective. I was listening to this comic actually, and she was talking about being a nice lady. And she said, nice ladies are never the ones in charge. You got to get stuff done. Don't always be nice all the time. It's sort of funny, right? So, all right, moving to the next slide, please. Body language is really important. As a facilitator, if you're in front of the room and you're doing this, you sort of lose your energy. You're not being listened to as much. So we do the Wonder Woman pose and really make sure you're owning the room, not sort of leaning on things, not over to the side like you're doing a presentation. And you want to be in there so you can come in terms of conflict and be able to work to be part of it. So that's a mediation strategy. Try not to diminuate yourself. And also as a man, if you are using the tactic of going over, just notice men tend to be higher and more imposing. So my strategy of walking over to people might not be the same for a tall man walking over to a small woman. So paying attention to gender and power dynamics is also important. So think about what works for you, but think about it. Think about how you're presenting yourself. I also really try to avoid this when I'm talking to people because it's closed off, and I'll stand like this, or I'm just noticing your body language and noticing other people's body language. So one thing when we're trying to get to agreements with a group, and it can also be distracting to be pacing around up here a lot, so I also try to stand in one place sometimes too, especially if I'm trying to make a point, because if I'm walking around all the time, it's hard to focus. Other people's body language is important as well. So sometimes we'll be trying to come up with a consensus decision, and we'll be looking around the room. We'll be like, okay, does everyone in agreement with that? And everyone just sort of looks at you. So we do this really dorky thing, which is really helpful, which is we have thumbs up, thumbs to the side, or thumbs down. And at first I thought it was really dorky, but I look around the room and I say, is everyone in agreement? Everyone sort of stares. And I'm like, okay, I guess that means yes. And then I do the thumbs up and I have like 2 thumbs down. I'm like, why didn't they say something? So sometimes that active, and then I'll go and I'll say, okay, what are you thinking about this? Why doesn't this work for you? So you look for those physical indications that we're on the same page. Or else a lot of times you have that meeting after the meeting. We call it a parking lot meeting. When everybody goes out to the parking lot after the meeting and says, well, I don't like what we just came up with, and they're having their separate process outside of the process you just had. So testing for understanding, testing for agreement is incredibly important, because a lot of times if people aren't agreeing, they're just not going to, if they're conflict avoiders, they're not going to say anything in the group. So having this sort of dorky, is everyone okay to move on, is actually a really important way to use body language to move forward in a process. Clothing, I always think about clothing as not being distracting to whoever. So if you're with a bunch of farmers, don't wear a suit and bow tie. If you're with a bunch of lawyers, maybe you're dressed up for that. So just think about what you're wearing and how that might influence how people are looking at you. Head, hands, and arm gestures. People don't like pointing, right? This feels bad. He said this. So just being careful about your types of gestures and watching other people's gestures as well. Next page, please, or next slide. So some asking questions, and we're going to get into this with reframing. I know I'm talking fast, but we have a lot to cover. And you guys are such an engaged group, which has been wonderful, but pace is really important. So generally, I try to slow down a little. Closed questions. When you're trying to find people's interests, asking a yes or no, do you care about safety, is not going to get you a full answer. The question might be, what do you think about safety on the I-70 project? So thinking about how to ask open-ended questions to encourage more information, because somebody might say yes, but then you really don't know any. Somebody might say, I might say, do you care? So you mentioned that quality life is important. Is that correct? They might say yes. What does quality of life even mean to that person, right? So the things that people, well, I really care about quality of life. The next question is, what is quality? What is that for you? Is it privacy? Is it quiet? Is it community? So digging a little deeper is very important with finding interests. Can you say more? I say that all the time. I'm like broken. Can you say more about that so I can understand? Interest identification, trying to figure out what are the deeper interests, and closure. So we talked a little bit about the agreement. Are we in agreement about this? I need to have some indication of yes or no if I'm just getting blank stares. You really have to ask for some sort of indication. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into the next exercise of framing and reframing, and we've practiced this a little, so this isn't new. So framing is figuring out what our interests are, what our deeper interests are, and reframing is thinking about reducing that toxic language and getting deeper into those interests. So your next job is going to be practicing how to reframe some of those more toxic things that we've been hearing toward the Sierra Club or toward your personal life. I mean, this can be hard with your partner at home sometimes. They don't like when you try to do this. They're like, you were late again. You're like, so I hear that you're concerned that I don't have a good conception of time. So this doesn't always work, but try to give it a go. So try that one. I'm not good with time. So let's move forward. Next slide, please. So this. So this is just a diagram of you're trying not just to reframe the content, you want to make sure you capture the emotional intensity. Even if you're trying to diffuse the situation, you don't necessarily want to rile people up, but you want to show that you understand their emotion. Like kids are in cages because of wolves, and you're like, I understand that you care about safety. That's not going to make them feel hurt. That's going to feel patronizing. So how are you actually saying, whoa, kids are in cages in Montana? That sounds like a real safety concern, like really reflecting the concern and the fear that people are having. So this is just showing with active listening framing, you have the feelings going to her. She has this big arrow that has the message with feelings and content. So and then you're testing for understanding. Am I getting this right? Let's go to the next page. Thank you. So the principles of reframing are every strong statement contains an underlying interest. So that's our good faith. Everyone's saying it for a good faith reason. Maybe in the end you find out they're trying to sabotage. When we're starting this process, we're saying that there is an interest underlying this toxic thing that you're hearing. People want a constructive response. People can switch to productive communication when they believe that their needs and interests are being recognized. It's really hard when somebody's acknowledging your concern to continue to be non-constructive. It's hard to do that. If you're saying, thank you for bringing that up, I appreciate it, let's talk about that. It's really hard to be like, you're still a jerk, right? I still hate you. So, but you do. Right. And so we're trying our best here to not have those emotional responses, but to take a step back and use these principles. Next slide, please. So first we listen, and that can be hard because you might already be charged up. You've already dealt with this person. You know where they're going with this, and it's hard to hear them because you've heard it. Take out what's unproductive in your reframing. What are the words that are charging you up, and what are the words that they're using to be provocative? Look for interests, which we already practiced. Restate the issue, the problem, maybe a solution. My advice would be don't try to make a solution early on. That's going to make people even angrier. Just state the issue, see if you got it right. And then reframe in impartial and affirmative language. I can't remember who said when we were doing one of these that there was I think it was you, Kirby, we can't do this. Like, how do you make this something that feels collaborative and productive?